Well, good afternoon to our friends on the East Coast and good morning to everyone tuning in elsewhere in the country. Welcome to this conversation on anti-Asian violence, sponsored by the American Ideals PAC. I am Ying Ma, founder and president of the organization. The American Ideals PAC is a political action committee that champions the ideal that we are all created equal and should be judged by the content of our character. We support candidates and policies that will protect equal rights and promote equal opportunity in this country. More information about us is available at americanidealspac.com. That is americanidealspac.com. We are here today because far too many vicious attacks against Asian Americans and immigrants have occurred, especially in the past few years. There is a great deal of fear, especially amongst elderly Asian immigrants, that they might be beaten senseless, perhaps even to death, for just walking down the street in bright daylight in a major American city. There is also a great deal of fear-mongering, especially from politicians eager to fan racial divisions, to mischaracterize and politicize the violent and hateful attacks when convenient, and then to ignore them when it is not. But then there is also faith. We keep faith in the goodness and common sense of the American people, who we know believe that violence visited upon innocent fellow Americans of any race, ethnicity, or color is unacceptable. So as we begin today, we offer our condolences for the victims of the recent mass shootings in Monterey Park and Half Moon Bay in California. We also offer our condolences to the family of Tyre Nichols, who lost their loved one in a brutal beating by the police in Memphis. For this webinar, our focus is anti-Asian violence, and we believe an honest, if uncomfortable, conversation about this topic is long overdue. We hope the next couple of hours will offer insights you won't hear anywhere else, possible solutions that no one else has proposed, and perhaps a path forward for peace, justice, and reconciliation that none of us will be too afraid to envision. The agenda for our event today will be as follows. Each featured speaker will have about 7 minutes to offer remarks, which will be followed by a discussion amongst the panelists for about 20 minutes, and then followed by Q&A with the audience. I know there are members of the media in attendance, and we will call on as many of you as possible. Here is the order in which the speakers will offer remarks. Michelle Steele, Betty Chu, Ying Ma, Bob Woodson, Linda Yang, and Ward Connerly. I will offer a fuller introduction of each speaker before his or her presentation. We will now hear from Congresswoman Michelle Steele, who represents the 45th Congressional District in the US Congress. Her district in Southern California includes Fountain Valley, Westminster, Cypress, Cerritos, Yorba Linda, and other cities and areas. Congresswoman Michelle Steele will offer her remarks in a short pre-recorded video.
Hi, my name is Congresswoman Michelle Steele. Discrimination and hate go against America's fundamental value. Every American should be free to run their businesses, go to school, and enjoy this great nation without fear of violence. We must do everything we can to stop the violence experienced by Asian Americans and ensure our nation is safe for everyone. That is why I introduced a bipartisan resolution in the House to condemn hate crimes committed against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. I have also worked for decades to stop anti-Asian discrimination in higher education because students deserve to be judged on their hard work and commitment to learning, not by their race. I look forward to hearing about your thoughts today, and I commend you for your work to bring light to this important topic. Thank you very much.
So I want to play two very short videos before we proceed to our next speaker. And I am going to share my screen with you again. So this is the first video. I know it's a little bit grainy, so I'll let it play one more time. And then I am going to share with you a second video.
Oh.
I'm not sure if you guys were actually able to see that video all that well.
We saw it. Yeah,
Okay.
we saw it.
Okay. Alrighty. And so the first incident, the first video that I showed is an attack that took place in mid-January, days before the mass shootings in Monterey Bay and Monterey Park in Half Moon Bay. The victim was 70 years old, and you guys saw that he was an elderly man walking with a cane. The second video showed an attack that took place in late January, days after the shootings in Monterey Park and Half Moon Bay. The victim was a 91-year-old woman with dementia, and she was attacked in front of her home. Both of these attacks happened in San Francisco. Now, while the two recent mass shootings in California had received wall-to-wall coverage across the country, the two sickening attacks on the elderly Asian victims you just saw have received scant to no national coverage. They did receive local coverage, however, but not much beyond that. The tragedy is that there are many, many more vicious, unprovoked attacks like these caught on video against Asians in America in recent years. Almost always, the suspects are not identified by race. We'll have more of a discussion about this a little later. Our next speaker will be Betty Chu. Betty is one of my all-time favorite people in the world. She is former mayor and two-term city council member of Monterey Park, a political leader and a trailblazer amongst Asian Americans. She is the first Chinese American woman to co-found and run a bank, and the first female Chinese lawyer in Southern California. In 2009, she was candidate for US Representative in California's 32nd Congressional District. And I am most proud to say that she is an advisor to the American Ideals PAC. Betty, the floor is yours.
Well, for many years now, I have been concerned about the anti-Asian violence, but there was a pause for me prior to the Monterey Park incident and prior to the recent reports of African American discrimination reparations, including discrimination in housing, which caused me again to think about discrimination against Asians, because it was anti-Asian violence and its silence that inspired me to establish the first federal financial institution in the nation that made home loans for Chinese applicants only 50 years ago this year. Prior to this, the Chinese in California didn't even have the privilege of being denied a home loan because they could not even get an application to fill out for submission. On contrary, African Americans, as well as other minorities, were able to obtain home loans from financial institutions owned within their own racial groups. So to the contrary we did not have any such institutions in California, nor in 1962. One of the main impetuses for the creation of this first Chinese federal savings and loan in the nation was the physical violence against the Chinese during the Watts riots of 1965. I will explain that in a minute. The rise in physical violence against Asians has recently taken place in the last 3 years in astronomical rates. However, massive Asian discrimination is not new in America. It started with physical violent discrimination, and it is this history of horrific physical violence against the Asian communities en masse that began in the 1800s, which culminated with the federal California and other states' Chinese exclusion laws, which racially discriminated against the Chinese in citizenship, housing, education, and employment, as well as other areas. Under these laws, Chinese can only work for Chinese employers or establish their own businesses on rental property. Since they were prohibited from owning real estate, they could only rent housing or rent locations for their businesses in the least desirable areas. And that's where it all began, with the massive Asian discrimination in the 1800s. It continued to exist even after the enactment of these Chinese exclusion laws, and it evolved for many years after the repeal of the government-sanctioned Chinese discrimination in diminishing differing racism forms and degrees in California. Mostly, for the most part, during many years, with isolated instances of physical violence. Now, massive racial physical violence occurred during the Watts riots of 1965, including those against Chinese and Chinese-owned businesses in the area. African Americans shot and burned many small Chinese-owned businesses in the area, necessitating the evacuation of many owners and their families who had living quarters in these establishments. The news media then and current histories of the 1965 Watts riots ignored and were completely silent on the report of the African American criminal violent actions targeted against these Chinese residents and business owners. This silence caused the inability of the two groups to work together in harmony, so that there could be a better understanding of each of the cultures of each of these, the African Americans as well as the Chinese Americans. Again, the African Americans also acted violently against the Korean community in the 1992 riots. This was only slightly mentioned in reports with justifications that, quote, the Blacks felt disrespected by the Koreans. Many of these justifications seem to excuse culpability of African American perpetrators violently threatening the lives of the Koreans and their property. However, the mere statement that, quote, Blacks felt disrespected by the Koreans, unquote, this disclosure led to community meetings among both groups that resulted in peaceful coexistence for many years. However, in the last 4 years, the racial discrimination crimes against individual race Asians have risen extensively. FBI reports that the hate crimes increased more than 73% in 2020 compared to hate crimes in general, which only rose 13% from 2019. This was the steepest percentage increase as compared to anti-Black and anti-Latino hate crimes. However, in the reports of the FBI, as well as reports in Stop Asian Hate, the race of the criminal is not generally identified, although narratives relating to white perpetrators were identified, and the victims, of course, were also identified by their race. When you look at the photos, however, from what happened from 2019 to the current period, the majority of the perpetrators, and it may not be the majority, but at least a substantial minority of the perpetrators are African Americans. Some news reports of the incidences and of political comments would lead one to believe that all of these perpetrators were white supremacists. And that is not proven to be correct when you look at the photos and hear more about what has really happened. And that is very troubling, because we cannot have a dialogue if we cannot tell the truth, so that the dialogue can help resolve these kinds of problems. As a former mayor and city council member of Monterey Park and a former Monterey resident for over 50 years, I was very surprised by the recent killings there. I also have my condolences to the survivors and families of the deceased victims involved in not only the shootings in Monterey Park, but also those up north, and continuing with isolated incidences. The overall crime rate, as well as the violent crime rate during my residency in Monterey Park, has always been lower than the average in California, as well as the average nationally. The initial reaction to the recent mass killings in Monterey Park by some press and politicians were not surprising. The presumption that it was a mass killing due to anti-Asian racism, and some speculations that a white supremacist was involved before the disclosure of the perpetrator. To contrary, this was a mass killing by an Asian with a personal grievance not rooted in racism. Also, the mass killing in Northern California was also by an Asian with a personal grievance related to his employment and not based upon racism. Nevertheless, politicians are using these rare incidents to promote their gun control political agenda. Despite the gun killings by Blacks and in Black communities in Chicago and New York, some often upon their own communities, are far greater than the recent ones by Asians in California. The use of those incidents publicly to promote the gun control agenda are not highlighted proportionately as compared to these recent California killings, nor are the killings by the M13 gang members similarly highlighted. The politicians need to first figure out how to—
Betty, I'm sorry to interrupt. Would you wrap up?
Yes. The politicians need to first figure out how to stop these perpetrators as compared to what is happening in California. And it lies in having truth in terms of legislation as well as public announcements. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Betty, very much for your remarks. And I should say that in recent years, there's been a sort of an awakening of political activism amongst Asian American communities across the country. But those of us who sort of came later in the game should never forget that it's trailblazers like Betty who have opened up doors for us, who have paved the path for us. And so we are as ever grateful to her leadership and her guidance for so many of us who fight for issues such as equal rights. So I am next in line to offer remarks, and I want to once again show a couple of very short videos. And I will share my screen with you again. So So I suspect that was a video that many of you have seen previously. It was played many times back in 2021. I'm going to show another video that you likely might have seen also back in 2021. So the first video you saw was an attack against an 84-year-old grandfather in San Francisco. He was an immigrant from Thailand. It took place in January 2021, and he subsequently died from his injuries. The second video was an attack that occurred in Oakland's Chinatown in February 2021. The victim was a 91-year-old man. Now, shortly thereafter, a tsunami of political protests materialized, along with condemnations from the most prominent national political leaders. Now, what explains the deafening silence that we've seen from national political leaders 2 years later in 2023 about the horrific attacks that continue to take place against Asians in America? The answer is actually very simple. In early 2021, opportunistic politicians and activists were in a mad hurry to blame white supremacy and Donald Trump for the vicious anti-Asian violence we saw on video time and time again. But time and time again, we saw, and some of us pointed out, that the perpetrators of the most horrific violence were not white, and the crimes were being perpetrated in heavily Democratic cities that were heavily opposed to Trump, both in 2016 and 2020. To keep blaming white supremacy and Trump was a bald-faced lie that became too much even for politicians who were accustomed to lying. Now, unfortunately, the violence against Asians has not ceased just because opportunistic people have stopped paying attention. As at the beginning of this webinar, I showed you 2 videos of brutal beatings of elderly Asian victims in San Francisco last month. Did we hear outrage from politicians like Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, who touts her Asian heritage, by the way, Nancy Pelosi, and the slew of elected officials in Congress who claim to care about stopping anti-Asian hate? We did not. Most likely they weren't even aware of the incidents, but I assure you that had the perpetrators been white, we would have heard about anti-Asian hate and white supremacy everywhere. Certainly, the San Francisco Bay Area has no monopoly on heinous violent crimes against Asians. Similarly, horrific attacks have occurred in New York, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Seattle, which we'll hear more about later, and other Asian American cities. Let us not forget the 61-year-old Chinese immigrant who was stomped to death while collecting cans at night in Harlem, or the 40-year-old woman who was shoved to her death in front of an oncoming subway train in Times Square in New York. In each case, the suspect was Black and the victim Asian. Yet, when you read the media coverage of these attacks, the word Black is never mentioned. By contrast, when a white person commits anti-Asian violence, the first thing you will find out is that the suspect is white. We saw this in the coverage of the man who murdered 8 Asians in different massage parlors in Atlanta back in March 2021. We also saw the same in the coverage of a white woman who stabbed an Asian college student in Bloomington, Indiana, while uttering racist statements just last month. Every one of these crimes is heinous, and each perpetrator should be condemned and punished to the fullest extent of the law. But why can't our friends in the media identify non-white suspects committing crimes against Asian people by their race? If the person is Black or brown, why can't you say Black or brown? What exactly are you afraid of? I would ask the same of the US government. A whole lot of violence perpetrated by one race against another might look awfully hateful, but they don't actually get classified as hate crimes, which is why it is important to have data on violent crimes. For the year 2018, Blacks committed more violent crimes against Asians than any other racial group did. That is 27.5% committed by Blacks versus 24% by whites and 24% by other Asians. The numbers come from the Bureau of Justice Statistics at the Justice Department. Curiously, we have not seen the subset of numbers disclosed by DOJ for reporting years after 2018. Where are these numbers? Why has the DOJ stopped providing them? I would close my presentation by sharing with you all that I grew up in inner city Oakland, California. I grew up seeing crime committed against me, my family, my friends, and others, men and women of all races and colors. Often there was a heavy racial component to the violence or threats of violence. I used to hear racial epithets practically every day, and that is every day, usually from those who were Black and brown. No one ever said anything, rarely did the victims object. My experiences didn't stop me from having Black and brown friends, mentors, and close associates. What it does tell me is that if we are too afraid as a society to identify crimes and racist behavior, particularly amongst young people, teenagers, we've seen a lot of teenagers commit crimes against the elderly, then we will not be able to prevent the crimes from happening in the future, nor will we be able to push for long-lasting change in the behaviors of everyone who might be prone to racial prejudice. And I assure you, every racial group is capable of racism. So let us not cower before grave injustice. Our next speaker is Linda Yang, and Linda is the director of Washington Asians for Equality. And I met Linda electronically, I guess it was in 2019, when she was one of the leaders at the helm of a David versus Goliath fight, a statewide campaign in Washington state. And what were they fighting against? They were fighting against an effort to reinstate race-based affirmative action in the state. And it was the first statewide political campaign that was led and won by Asian Americans in the United States. That campaign not only ensured that voters passed state law, state law that voters had passed, I believe it was back in 1998, that what was passed in 1998, banning discrimination and preferential treatment, would remain intact in 2019. And it was a very impressive grassroots effort. And Linda has been advocating for equal treatment for all and Asian Americans ever since. I should note, just on a personal note, that I worked with Linda on that campaign. I was a media consultant, and the following year in 2020, I served as the communications director of the No on Prop 16 campaign in California. And here's what and the No on 16 campaign in California was sort of a similar effort in the sense that here in California, we were fighting against an effort to also reinstate racial preferences to overturn the will of the people. And in California, just as in Washington state, both of those attempts were defeated. Now, what was so impressive, I thought, about the effort that Linda led was that they had a lot less help than we did in California. In California, we had veterans and giants like Ward Connerly, who will, offer us his remarks later. We had veteran strategists. We had people who were intimately involved in our campaign, providing strategic guidance to a group of people, a group of Asian American activists who were very enthusiastic, but complete rookies at the political game, and who really needed a tremendous amount of guidance. And that was what I saw when I first arrived on the No on 16 campaign. But what was so impressive about the campaign that Linda led was that I think in many ways they owned it. They owned the efforts, and they were the people who organized on a grassroots level. No doubt they had help from others, they had advice, but what I saw was that they really led that effort themselves, and it was truly a David versus Goliath fight. And I think on the media front, it got a lot less national attention because California tends to get more attention than most other states in the country. But it was a truly impressive feat, and we are just so pleased to have Linda with us today to offer her remarks. So Linda, please.
Let me just unmute it. Okay, yeah, thank you, Ying, for this introduction. I'm really honored. The I 1000 RAA campaign was, I would say that was a lifetime experience. Never really expected, but yeah, I'm glad we won. So yeah, on the anti-Asian hate crime thing, it really touched me, because if you follow the mainstream media, you would think the anti-Asian crimes are dwindling. But if you follow those like Asian news outlets like Next Shark, Asian Down, you probably see those reports of those crimes, those horrific crimes, almost every week, if not every day. And when I talk to people from Chinatown in Seattle, they told me those stories. They didn't feel safe walking in the Chinatown, Seattle. They get spit on, their car got broken, all those kind of things. But the mainstream media are not covering those stories, anymore. I think they are only interested in covering stories that fit their narratives. I think this really need to be called out, because Asian Americans are still facing those crimes against them, especially our elderlies, those women. But their stories has been largely ignored by the mainstream media. And we need to really ask proper coverage of all those anti-Asian crimes so that we can address them. Because if we don't report them, people think they don't exist. So last November, I think, there was an incident in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood. A Black woman was yelling racist tirade at an Asian American woman. A local Korean American journalist has been covering this story for many days. No mainstream media in Seattle area pick up that story. Eventually, Next Shark picked up that story, give it more exposure. It's more at the national level. The Black woman was yelling at, go eat your dog with some rice, go back to your country, all those kind of, racial slurs. When I saw that news, I immediately remembered, actually a year prior to that, we received a complaint from students about a textbook that was used at one of our local school districts. In that book, it implies that Chinese would eat mice, and we have all those racial stereotyping behaviors. So I was busy at the time. I didn't follow through to request the school district to remove it. But after I saw that news, I was like, no, I really have to do something. So I contacted school district and requested a review of the book. And I just received a confirmation from the school district yesterday that they're replacing the 1960s version with which contained the social stereotypes, with the 2022 version, from which those offensive contents has been removed. So hopefully, the future student will not, mistakenly learn those racial stereotypes from those outdated books. This is just example, how if we are honest about what happened, we can make differences. We can make improvement. Whenever I have a chance, I like to talk to people from other community. I just want to get understanding, our, where we, in agreement, where we have differences. And I honestly think the Asian community and the Black community have a lot in common. You mentioned about the I-1000 R880 campaign in 2019. We got help from people from the Black community. They help us collect signatures so we can qualify the referendum. We have, people from the Black community sitting on our, campaign as co-chair. And of course, Ward Connerly has been there with us, advised us, throughout the entire campaign. We're very, very grateful for that. So really, the Asian community and the Black community, really, we have many things in common. We have some common values. I want to quote, use a quote from a Black state representative. We had a meeting last, maybe October-ish. We talk about our communities. At the very end of our meeting, she said, we're closer than we're further apart. But I think the media is not doing a very good job uniting the two communities. I want to specifically call out those rhetoric about the anti-Blackness in the Asian community. I'm very, very offended by that. I don't think I have anti-Blackness. The Asian people I interact, I don't think they have anti-Blackness. When I first saw the word, anti-Blackness, calling Asian as anti-Blackness was from a NBC piece. The author was a second-generation Asian. She accused her mom, who barely speak English, anti-Blackness because she liked to wear skin product for lighter skin color. I just think that's ridiculous. But then during the height of the anti-Asian hate, a local school district, they put together materials for anti-Asian hate. And in that material, they have a link to the talk about the anti-Blackness, or like, wait a minute, you're fanning the hate. So I actually reach out to the school district, and we have parents reach out to the school district. They remove that link. So we're seeing more and more of those like anti-Blackness like claims. I think NBC is the worst. So even in the on the Washington State on Asian Pacific American Affairs, they had a dedicated page on its site called Combating Anti-Blackness. On that site, it says, as community members, we commit to doing the difficult but necessary work of understanding white skin and light skin bias, anti-Blackness, and racism in our own community. This is just feel like cultural revolution. Anything can be baselessly offensive, and they can find you guilty of anything. This will unnecessarily fan the divide between the Asian and the Black community and promote more anti-Asian crimes. I want to, I think it was maybe more than a year ago, I was watching, there was this there's an interview and there was this influential celebrity from the Black community or talking about how Asians, dislike Black. The example was like, she was waiting in line at the airport and the Asian in front of her didn't, start a conversation with her. I was like, this is America. You don't need to speak to everyone around you, and Asians are naturally introvert. It's pretty normal. We don't talk to people we're not familiar with. But I can guarantee if you start a conversation, they will respond, with warm response. But it's just like those narratives of anti-Blackness, when you let them sink in, people will pick on any single behavior and label it. And that's just not healthy. So I think to combine, I know the anti-Asian hate crime is a much complicated issue, but I think to combat the anti-Asian hate crime, we really need to unite our communities, build understanding and trust among them. We also need to be honest about those crimes, and so we can tackle them head on. In every crime there's a root cause. For it to be the behavior could be community, and could be the misunderstanding. We need to understand them and we need to face them. So no sugarcoating, no covering up. Thank you. That's my remark.
All right, thank you very much, Linda. And while you were speaking, I realized that I had actually picked on you out of order. So I was supposed to invite Bob to speak next. So I am sorry about that. Apologies to you both. Let me introduce our next speaker, Robert Woodson, who is the founder and president of the Woodson Center. He is also the founder and president of two other organizations, 1776 Unites and Voices of Black Mothers United. Mr. Woodson founded the Woodson Center in 1981 to help residents of low-income neighborhoods address the problems of their communities. You know, and this is something that I am a huge fan of, having grown up in inner city Oakland and having grown up in a neighborhood that was full of crime and poverty. You know, I hear conservatives talk a lot about getting government out of the lives of the people who live in these communities. And I agree with that, but oftentimes there aren't a whole lot of people offering solutions to the members of those communities, you know, offering solutions for renewal, for progress. And so, you know, I am in particular a fan of anybody who goes into those communities and actually helps to make them better by, you know, allowing these communities to help themselves. Mr. Woodson is also a former civil rights activist. He has headed the National Urban League Department of Criminal Justice, has also been a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research, and he is referred to by many as the godfather of the neighborhood empowerment movement. He is an early MacArthur Genius Awardee and the recipient of the 2008 Bradley Prize. And then he's also received the Presidential Citizens Award and a 2008 Social Entrepreneurship Award from the Manhattan Institute. Bob, thank you so much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you. I will take probably a different tack than what I've heard. My early civil rights experience has sort of informed me a lot. I led demonstrations in Westchester, Pennsylvania, a city 30 miles west of Philadelphia, the home of Bayard Rustin. People don't realize that when Dr. King and Rustin came through different cities, they brought the media attention and we were able to present local issues. But after the death of Dr. King, we were leading demonstrations outside of a pharmaceutical company. And when they desegregated, they hired 9 Black PhD chemists. And when we approached them to join our movement, they refused and said they got these jobs because they were qualified. When this happened several times, I realized that the civil rights movement, when the doors are open, not all people could walk through. Dr. King said, what good does it do to have the right to eat in a restaurant of your choosing or living in a neighborhood if you don't have the means to exercise that right? So I realized that just having opportunity wasn't enough, that people needed to be prepared to walk through. And I realized at that point too, that it was a real split in the Black community, that many of the civil rights leaders went on to become elected officials. They were the ones also administering the $22 trillion we spent on poverty programs, where 70% of it went to the people to serve the poor. So we created a commodity out of poor people. And so I left that movement then until now, realizing that I had to work among low-income people of all races, that low-income people, whether they're Asian, Hispanic, they have more in common with their peers who are also in that class than sometimes they have in common with their middle class and upper income counterparts. So I have been working on behalf of low-income people. To me, those are the people. And so I bring that perspective to this issue of crime and violence. If you look at the numbers, more Blacks are killed in 1 year today than 50 years of the Klan. More Blacks. 6,000 children are killed. 70% of those are Black children, and these are killed by other Blacks. So this is a problem that is spreading. But what troubles me a little bit as we look for solutions, when I read the response of the White House to the Asian violence, what is it that this task force proposed? Equity, justice, and opportunity, access to federal contracts, increased federal workforce, diversity, outreach, and engagement. My question is, what do those remedies that are perhaps unjust, what do that have to do with improving the safety of people in these communities? You know, and as a consequence, anytime you generalize about a group, all Asians or all Blacks, and then you try to apply remedies without disaggregating that population, it always ends up helping those that are better educated and that are not living in vulnerable communities at the expense of those who are living in vulnerable communities. I'll give you an example of with the women's movement. The women's movement started as a consequence of a Black woman in Harlem wanting to give her peers a voice about abuse. Okay, so other women joined it. It became the Me Too movement. And then the emphasis did not shifted more to class than it did issues. And so then the women's movement got defined as, so what were the solutions for women? More appointments to boards of directors, more jobs. In other words, these are remedies that help those women at the top end at the expense of those at the bottom. At the same time, Geraldo Ribeiro did a 2-hour special about the sexual rape of women in prisons for 2 hours. Every one of the women that were sexually assaulted was Black. Every perpetrator was Black. But yet it did not provoke a single debate or discussion, nor was there any outcry coming from, because it did not fit the racial narrative. And that's my claim. So it seems to me that when we are considering remedies, I think we have to disaggregate dealing with general discrimination and the increasing in federal contracts and all of that. I don't see how that remedy relates to the problem of abuse of people in these communities. What I think, what we have done at the Woodson Center is we first of all went into the communities suffering the problem and asked the people there what were their priorities. We found in the Black communities, while the progressives were defunding the police of Black Lives Matter, 80% of the Black community is against defunding the police. 60% of Black surveys said they didn't believe that racial discrimination was a principal barrier to their flourishing. And so what we did was go in and give voice to the thousands of mothers who lost children to homicide. And they came up with ways to prevent. So my point is, in order to address this problem, it seems to me that rather than coming up with remedies that are coming on high from the White House or from other issues, that we parachute into these communities opportunities that have to do with employment contracts and that's one set of issues, but that must be separated from making vulnerable people less vulnerable. And how do you do that? Well, what we have done, for instance, is going into those communities and realizing that there was a moral and spiritual dimension to this. So I won't take the time to go into detail. We have something called violence-free zone, where we go into the community suffering a problem, recruit young adults in there whose lives have been redeemed and transformed. Maybe they're former predators. And we have empowered them to reach out to the young people in that community, to witness to them and bring them into Peace PAC. We went into a community that was 55 gang murders in a 5 square block area in 2 years. By organizing people in that community, we were able to take these small groups of young people who were creating the terrorism and turn them around and make them ambassadors of peace. And so you saw large-scale reductions in violence within that community. In Bensonhurst, New Jersey, for instance, some years ago, the Hasidic Jews in those communities came together with Black Muslims who were supposed to be their brothers, because their greatest threat were the Black drug dealers. So these indigenous civic groups came together to aid and support one another. And as a consequence, they were able to drive the drug dealers out. It seems to me that part of our strategy for reducing violence has to promote greater cooperation among civic organizations in these low-income communities. Sometimes small Black churches and others can come together because they have more in common. Both Asians and Blacks are being terrorized primarily by Blacks. And I agree with you as saying that there needs to be more truth in reporting of these crimes. That I can almost tell anytime that an Asian is assaulted and they don't mention the race of the perpetrator, I know it's a Black person. I know that. But also we must speak up in support of law enforcement, because there is a strong correlation between reduced policing by demonizing the police. We are strong supporters of law enforcement. Our Voices of Black Mothers United have partnership events all over the country where the police are invited in to work with local groups to promote the safety of. So I think those of us who are supposed to be anti-violence, we must be strong supporters of law enforcement and be very explicit about that. And we should push back against anyone that tries to racialize this. And at the only time there is outrage is when the perpetrator is Black, or where the perpetrator is white. We don't have a race problem in that degree. What we do have a civic crisis, a moral and spiritual freefall that is really demonizing human life to the point where young people no longer value their own life, to the point where even in Silicon Valley, the leading cause of death among teenagers is suicide, the highest rate in the country. Among low-income whites in Appalachia, it's prescription drugs, and it's homicide in the inner city. Each of those groups have more in common to help fill that emptiness in the lives of people. And so if we want to reduce crimes, I think we've got to get together with civic institutions with inside and begin to fund strategies that are being designed by people in those communities to address the needs of their young people in the community. But it's an inside strategy, and we have models of around the country. In fact, I'll be on Fox Saturday night with Lawrence Jones's show, along with a few others, giving some examples of where and how these interventions in these urban centers are working to reduce violence inside. And hopefully we can partner with people in the Asian community who are similarly situated, who want to see solutions coming from within the community. Asians and Blacks should be protecting one another and coming together and partnering with others, but because they share a common enemy.
Well, thank you, Bob, very much. You know, when there was a lot of attention paid to anti-Asian violence in early 2021, and when everybody was talking about it, it seems, I called for leaders to condemn Black on Asian violence, and I specifically called on Black leaders to do so. I called on Obama to do it, Kamala Harris, Black pastors, not because I think that others should not do it, but because I think that there are many white leaders who are simply afraid to utter those words. And I think that there are Black leaders who have sort of a special moral authority. Not very many people answered my call. What I have noticed is that in the intervening years, Bob Woodson has repeatedly condemned Black on Asian violence. I'm not taking any credit for it because I don't think he's doing it because, because I was asking Black leaders to take, to take those actions. But I think, we are grateful for your honesty because I think that I think there are a lot of people who refuse to identify Black perpetrators or refuse to be honest about this crime against Asians because they are afraid. And there's always accusations that somehow, if we're honest about this, that somehow we're racist against Black people. That simply isn't the case. But I think it is, and it certainly shouldn't stop anybody of any race to talk about it. But I do think that there is, it provides a different kind of credibility when Black leaders are willing to speak out, especially Black leaders like Bob Woodson, who has the kind of experience and wisdom that he has. So thank you, Bob, for your comments and for all that you've done. Our next speaker is Ward Connerly, someone that many of us know well. Ward is Ward is someone I met back in 1996 when I was sort of a foot soldier for the Prop 209 campaign here in California. He was the chairman of the campaign. He probably doesn't even remember meeting me back then, but that was the campaign that started a national movement, perhaps even a revolution. So Ward Connerly is a nationally renowned advocate of equal opportunity for all Americans, regardless of race, sex, or ethnic background. A former University of California regent, he is founder and president of the American Civil Rights Institute, which is a national nonprofit organization aimed at educating the public about the need to move beyond race and specifically racial and gender preferences. In 2020, he served as president of California's No on Prop 16 campaign, which defeated a proposition that sought to repeal the part of the state constitution passed as Prop 209 in 1996 that prohibits racial discrimination and racial preferences in public employment, public contracting, and public education. The No on 16 campaign went on to win by a 57% to 43% margin, despite being outspent by 16-1. Since Ward led the Prop 209 campaign to victory in 1996, he has led a national political movement, as I mentioned earlier, and that movement has passed similar measures throughout the country. To date, there are 9 states in the union: California, Washington, Florida, Michigan, Nebraska, Arizona, New Hampshire, Oklahoma, and Idaho that have banned racial and gender preferences via ballot initiative, legislation, or executive order. And Ward is also author of 2 books, Creating Equal, My Fight Against Race Preferences, and the second book is Lessons from My Uncle James, Beyond Skin Color and the Content of Our Character. Beyond Skin Color to the Content of Our Character. I'm also proud to say that Ward is the chairman of the American Ideals PAC's advisory committee. Ward, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Ying. I'm delighted that you have put this together. Let me apologize for my attire. I looked at my friend Bob Woodson, all decked out in tie and looking splendid, and here I am with the attire that I'm wearing. I am involved in a major battle with my kidneys, and so I get dialysis, and that does not allow me to dress up anymore. We have a real problem in the country about this issue that we're focusing on, and I must applaud this panel you put together. I mean, every one of them are heroines and heroes of mine, and are fighting the good fight. Linda Yang, in particular, brought me into her campaign in Washington, and David did defeat Goliath. because of Linda. So Linda, I'm so impressed with what you have done.
Thank you.
But we have a real problem, and it seems as if it's this tug and pull situation in which we look at people of Asian descent as foreigners. And you hear people say, go back to where you came from, as if people of Asian descent don't belong in America. And that's the reason why I always say I don't like the term Asians. It's Americans of Asian descent. Just as there are Americans of African descent, people that we describe as Asians are Americans. And we have to get that through our thick skulls and treat them accordingly with respect, rather than marginalizing them as we are. You know, as we look at what's going on in the country right now, while we are fighting and trying to call attention to the problem of violence against people of Asian descent, people who are, quote, Black, some of them are calling for reparations. People of Asian descent, on the other hand, are saying, we don't want reparations. We just want you to treat us fairly when our kids go to college, when they apply to go to college. And so the Supreme Court right now is entertaining the question of, are people of Asian descent being discriminated against when they apply to Harvard and by extension, other universities? And the answer is clearly, yes, they are. And that has to be ended. We have to start recognizing the problem that we have as a country and how we deal with the problem, with the issue of those who are of Asian descent. It is a major problem. They play by the rules, and I don't like discussing it in terms of they and us and all of that, but just forgive me for doing that. We treat people of Asian descent as if they don't exist. They don't exist. We, in our perception. And so it's okay for us to discriminate against them when their kids apply to go to college. When we find that they're getting too many of the college seats, we want to do away with the SAT. And we know why we're doing away with the SAT, because we want to diminish the number of people of Asian descent who are going to be admitted. But on the other hand, when they play by the rules and they succeed, then they are victims of discrimination as well as violence. And there is silence, total silence when that happens. We don't call attention to that. That is a major societal problem. It's easy for us to point the finger at media and say that the media is responsible. And yeah, to a large extent, they are. But the basic problem is that in our society, we are not treating those who are of Asian descent with equal respect, with equal attention, and not discriminating against them. So my message is, understand the dynamics of what's going on. Understand what Bob is saying about the neighborhood and treating the neighborhoods and people within neighborhoods equally. Understand Betty's message, who is talking about the problem of getting loans and all of that. Understand Betty's message. Please read her statement and understand it. Linda Yang has fought the good fight and is fighting it right now and trying to call attention to things in her state of Washington. These progressive states, Washington and California, are the two most progressive states in the Union. They're the ones who want to roll back the ban on preferences and treating people differently. Think about that. California and Washington want to be able to discriminate on the basis of race, and they are the most progressive states in the Union. So we have a huge problem in our society. I'm delighted that Ying has put this together to focus attention on it. Yes, there is violence against people of Asian descent. A lot of elderly people who are of Asian descent are afraid to go out after dinner and walk in their neighborhoods for fear of being attacked by someone, probably a Black person. Let's admit that. There is a specific problem of Black crime that is being performed in disproportionate numbers in Black neighborhoods, where people of Asian descent also happen to reside, but they are Black people doing that. And I'm so glad that those of us in the Melanin Caucus, Bob Woodson and I and others, are willing to call attention to this problem and to say that problem exists and we have to do something about it. So, Ying, I'm delighted that you have pulled this together. All of you on this panel, I appreciate everything that you're doing in this regard. To those who are tuned into this, please further the cause. You know, there are a lot of people who don't believe there is a problem of violence against people of Asian descent. That's why they ignore it. It's not a conscious thing. People just don't understand that there is a problem. And this is helping to focus attention on it. And our work is not done. We're going to have to follow this up with efforts to make sure that people feel safe in their own communities. They're not singled out because they happen to be of Asian descent. And there's hate. I don't think there's hate so much as they're an easy target. And therefore people try to exploit that. But we need to be vigilant about dealing with this and make sure we understand that all of us are in this country, a great country. All of us are here and we're all connected. Doesn't matter whether someone is Latino or of Asian descent or white or Black or declined to state, it doesn't matter. We're all Americans entitled to the equal protection of the law. And I hope that the Supreme Court this June hands down a decision that eliminates race preferences in college. And by extension, that decision will put us on the kind of footing that our founders envisioned when they said we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. We have to get to that point, and I hope that the court renders the decision that is long awaited and long overdue, that we all have to be treated equally at the schoolhouse door as well in the rest of society. So Ying, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Ward. You know, I know I gave you sort of a formal introduction, but I should also add that not only have you led the equal rights movement in the last 30 years or so, I think there is one intangible contribution that people don't always know about, which is your mentorship of a lot of newcomers to to political activism over the years. I think a lot of times, first-time activists, especially Asian American activists, getting involved in the political process for the first time. Many of them probably speak English as their second language. They don't quite know what the system is all about, and I think sometimes they get involved because their immediate interests are threatened. They don't want to see their children discriminated against in college admissions. But time and time again, I know that over the years, you have reminded all of us that we are all connected. This isn't about Asians and whites against Blacks and Hispanics. This is about equal rights, and it is about created equal, and it is about it is about the Constitution. It is about what it means to be an American. And I've seen you mentor so many activists and others over the years, particularly those who know very little about the American political process. And you have brought forth a whole gang of people all across the country who are now fighting for equal rights. And so I think for that, many of us across the country, I think in fact the country as a whole owes you a huge debt of gratitude. So we will forgive you for not being as stressed up as Bob today. What we're going to move on to the Q&A session in a little bit, but before we do that, I do want to sort of sum up some action items, because I know those of you who are listening in the media, sometimes it helps for people to give you some bullet points. It makes your job easier. And so let me just point out some of the things that we've kind of action items that we've called for today. Number one, those of you in the media, our friends in the media, please be honest. Please identify the race of the perpetrators when there is an anti-Asian attack. It is not that hard. You know what the race is because oftentimes the race appears in the videos. Number two, I think, and this is something I pointed out, we would like the US government, DOJ in particular, to make the stats available, the stats on violent crime. Those stats aren't just about Asian people, because through those stats, we also see just how much crime is committed by Blacks against other Blacks. And I took a look at it this morning for the year 2018. I believe it was something like 70%. That's an astonishing number. We're not going to tackle that issue today, but it is worthwhile for the country to understand these stats, because if we're going to constantly talk about racism, let's have some context, let's have some background. Number three, I think it is important for leaders of all stripes, Black, white, Hispanic, and Asian, to actually, be honest as well, to denounce Black on Asian violence unequivocally. We haven't heard from many of our sitting elected officials, but it doesn't mean that we have to rely entirely on them. I think some of the people who will make the most contributions perhaps are leaders on the local level. I agree with Bob that there are partnerships that are ready to be formed on the local level. I have great faith that Black pastors, somewhere along the lines, and of course, I don't know every one of them. I don't, spend my life paying attention to what Black churches do across the country, but I have great faith that the leaders at these Black churches will step up to the plate if we, make the connections, if we have the conversations. I have more faith in them than I do in our national elected leaders, in fact. But I think one, for that action item, I think it behooves our national leaders of every color to actually be honest about this issue. And to Ward's point, I think it bears, and I think this is something Linda addressed as well, which is to not see Asian Americans as foreigners. I know Ward prefers the term Americans of Asian descent, which I fully applaud, but I'm lazy, and so sometimes I just don't use as many words. In any case, the point is that that I think that history about discrimination against Asians in this country, as well as not demonizing the progress that Asian immigrants have made, particularly in higher education. All of that is important because it has an impact on how the rest of the country sees this community. And am I forgetting any other specific action items that you guys have mentioned? If I did, please feel free to chime in. No? Okay. So we are going to open up the floor. Now, before we open this up to our friends in the media and others who are members of the public, I am also super pleased that we have in the audience Wai Wah Chin, who is an adjunct fellow at the Manhattan Institute in New York, and who is the founding president of the Chinese American Citizens Alliance of Greater New York, which is an all-volunteer organization advocating for equal rights for New Yorkers, especially in education. A graduate of Yale, Princeton, and Columbia. Those are 3 very impressive schools. Wai Wah is a relentless advocate for the Chinese American community. And her work at the Manhattan Institute also advances support for school choice and addresses issues faced by Asian Americans in New York. Ward mentioned earlier that that Linda and Betty are both just wonderful leaders in their in their respective states, and I think that Wai Wah in many ways is actually a leader that we are so thrilled to have in the Asian American community. She's done an incredible amount to lead the efforts in New York City. And we're grateful that she's joined us today. So before we go to the floor, we're gonna ask her to offer some observations of what she's seen in New York and just her thoughts on this issue in general.
Thank you, Ying. It's great to see you. It's great to see everybody here. I think I've had the tremendous pleasure of working with a number of you. Only Bob I have not spoken to before, so hello, Bob. Or it's wonderful to see you. We last saw each other on the steps of the Supreme Court, actually. Right. This was just several months ago about the case that Ward just mentioned, the SFFA versus Harvard. Linda, of course, we've worked with before on Washington, and Betty I've known for years and years. She is a pioneer in so many ways. This is a tremendous group. I admire you all so much. And Ying, thank you so much for putting this together. I noticed that we have some commonality here. The big threads that we have here that we've talked about is how do we address the hypocrisy that's going on in not dealing with the real issues. The real issue of crime cannot be solved if we are going to lie about it. And it's not pitting one group against another. It's not about Blacks attacking Asians. It does happen to be true that they are something like 90% of the incidents in New York area are going to be perpetrated by non-Asian people of color on Asians. And they are more Black than Hispanic. So I think that we have to look at the problem here, that it is not just a matter of attacking Asians, but we have to stop this crime, period. And too often it becomes a photo op. The politicians are not here to address the problem. They want to just go and say, oh, we have a white supremacist attack. We have a Trump supporter. And I'm looking at New York and say, find me a Trump supporter. There aren't that many. And they certainly don't look like the guys who are coming out to attack us. So this kind of political move means that the politicians don't even care about us. It's a lie. And we have to look at those politicians and hold them to our real values, principles, and their responsibilities. Their responsibility is not to lie to us. Their responsibility is to try to find reasonable solutions. And some of the solutions are going to be basic. It's going to be trying to make sure that crimes are going to be prosecuted. We have crimes that are not prosecuted in New York. We have laws on hate crimes that are hard to enforce. And actually, we don't want to make people fall into the trap of thinking this is a hate crime and this is not. Because if somebody did not say something, did not say a slur, it doesn't make the crime any better for the victim. Of course, there are things like hate crimes, but I think that the first thing is that we should address the crime, and that would take care of a lot of the problems. We have this huge problem of Black on Black crime. Most of the crimes that Blacks commit are against Blacks. And that's a horrible thing for their community, an extremely bad one. And that's something that the politicians should stop and say that we can't have non-prosecution of crimes. We can't throw people into jail and not do anything with them there. This is not a good criminal justice system. You have to go and make policy changes that will help really rehabilitate. So if we're talking about rehabilitation, it must be truly rehabilitated. And for the problems of the attacks against Asians, that is something that we have to be very, very cautious and conscious of, because I don't see it declining, unfortunately. We have more and more incidents. We have more complaints too. And some of it is because people are starting to complain, which is good, because if you never complain about it and you never record it, and a lot of Asians, as you may know here in the panel, a lot of Asians do not report the crimes, even if they're not a specifically hate crime. And let's say even a crime of opportunity, they don't report it because the cost of reporting is so high, and the returns, the finding and punishing of a perpetrator is so low that it's often considered not a worthy use of one's resources. We held a crime forum here, a public safety forum in Chinatown here some years ago, and it was devastating to hear one story after another by people who said, "Oh, we don't bother to report it," even though they were slugged or spat upon and robbed, pushed to the ground. It's only the really sensational ones that got into the newspapers. And we have to change that on many grounds. So I applaud this group here. I think we have to hold our politicians to the fire, put their feet to the fire over here and say that you're not solving the problem. You have to face the problem. Don't lie about it. Be very direct. And then they make the changes in the policies, make the changes in the laws. Stop saying we're going to not prosecute. Stop making it hard to do discovery. Stop making it impossible to have kids to stop them from also joining the criminal life, because the crimes have been made decriminalized. So everybody knows it. You have older criminals basically taking younger ones and saying, you can do all the crimes for us because you're not going to land up in jail. That is not the way to solve the problem of the hate crimes against Asians, because they know that they could go and slug people with impunity. And it hurts them too, because this is the stealing of opportunities and lives of the perpetrators as well as the victims. It's both ways. And so I applaud this conference, and let's work together to try to solve this. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Wai Wah. And so we're going to go to the audience in a minute for questions. Those of you who wish to ask a question, could you please raise your hand on Zoom? And I know a number of you, but I don't know everybody. So if you could also just go to the chat function and just identify yourself and your affiliation, that would be greatly appreciated. So I'm going to give you guys a minute to do that. But also, I should also note that because we started about 20 minutes late, I know some of you probably need to run at 11. We're going to just run over a little bit, but but those of you who are able, please stay with us. And Wai Wah's comments actually reminded me of something, which is that one action item we did talk about in our comments was law and order. Bob specifically talked about just the complete lunacy of the defund the police movement, because we know that soft on crime DAs, as well as public officials who don't enforce the law, those policies hurt the most vulnerable in our communities, and they hurt members of the low income communities, whether it's Black or brown or Asian. And so we've seen, as Wai Wah mentioned, we've seen a lot of crimes against Asians go unpunished, but a lot of crimes against everybody have gone unpunished. And that is a fundamental problem that we need to address in this society. And that is one thing that we need to hold our public officials accountable for. So I am going to go to questions right now. And our first question is from African American Conservatives. It is a podcast. And I will let you introduce your podcast further. But please unmute yourself and ask your question. So, so DK, you are on the screen as a panelist. Could you unmute yourself and ask your question? All right, so why don't I do this? I'm going to go to the next question while our friend from African American Conservatives podcast is sorting out any tech problems he may have. Our next question comes from Kathy Zhang, Sound of Hope. Okay, so you know what? So Terrence, we're going to go to you next. You're on the screen, but we're going to go to you next. Well, Kathy, if you could unmute yourself, please go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, hi, Ying. Hi, Ward. It's great to see you again. Yeah, this is Kathy Zhang with the Sound of Hope Media Group. So I have a couple of questions. First of all,
Kathy, I'm sorry to interrupt. Would you maybe just say a couple of words about your organization, your media outlet? Because I think those who are outside of California may not be familiar with it.
Okay, sure. So Sound of Hope Media Network, we based in San Francisco, and we are the largest Chinese public radio in the nation. We also expanded to video programmings on the multiple video platforms. We also broadcast into China with uncensored information via shortwave, and we reached to over 1 million audience in the United States and millions of audience through other platforms. So yeah, and we were very actively reporting on, we started to actively reporting on this related issue back in 2014 as the California State Senate tried to repeal Proposition 209 through the SCA 5. And that's when I connected with the ward, Mr. Connerly at that time. So to educate our Chinese community about how, racial preference, what that is and how it's affecting the community. So yeah, and thanks to the panelists today. And I have a couple of questions. First of all, as Ying, you summarized some of the action items, especially, for example, for the government agencies, DOJ, to make stats available. So is there any, would you do any specific actions to try to make that happen? And for the media, I know media who are here, see, can hear what your appeal, but I just wonder, are you planning to do anything specific in that regard for them to identify the races of the perpetrators when they report? So that's my.
Go ahead. Why don't you ask your second question as well?
Okay. My second question is, I've heard some of the Black pastors and also others saying that they're saying that the Black people who has more crimes because they are poor, and that's why they should be. For example, in California, in San Francisco, they are talking about reparation of $5 million per person for the Blacks. And so that's basically the reason they are saying they're rationalizing why there is so much crime in the Black community. So I just wonder how the panelists think of that, and what do you think should be done in terms of how to address this issue. Actually, can I add one more question? Is because of my background, I know a lot about what's going on in China with the Chinese government. The Chinese Communist government, actually, they are manipulating the race divide, the race issue in the United States, and that they actually have been behind some of the movements from the Chinese Asian community trying to stand up to their rights. I just wonder, are you aware of that? Do you have any suggestions on how to avoid that, kind of infiltration? I know it's a lot.
Yes. So why don't I take your first and third questions, and then I'll let others address your second question. On your question about contacting DOJ, we are certainly open to that, but I think let's say if I send them a message today, most likely it's just going to be ignored. I think this is where we could have help from friends in the media. If you guys broadcast this publicly, the more you talk about it, if you guys would help us publicize this issue, I think that would be helpful. I also want to make sure, one of the things I've done in recent days is to contact people who are far more well-versed in criminology and in just the study of crime than I am, because maybe this is a problem that I'm encountering. Maybe I'm just not finding the data, but it's elsewhere buried amongst the gazillion tons of data that the government does have. And so, and so if there are criminologists who are able to find this elsewhere, I would certainly welcome hearing from them. And in the, in recent days, I've contacted some of them. However, we're a very new organization. We started with practically zero resources. Right now, our resources are extremely limited. So there is a limited amount of what we can do. We would always like to do more, but this is also an area where we would call on our, members of the public to provide support if they enjoy seeing what we're doing. Our website is AmericanIdealsPAC.com. That's AmericanIdealsPAC.com. Folks can go to our website, donate, sign up for our mailing list. I think that'll help us continue doing the kind of work we do. Your third question about the communist government. Yes, we are aware of the activities that they are engaged in. We're certainly aware that they sent members of the communist state media to infiltrate Chinese for Affirmative Action in the No on 16 campaign in 2020. Let me take back the word infiltrate, because I don't think that's the right word to use. What we do know is that Chinese for Affirmative Action had staffers who were actually members of the Chinese state media. Now, let's not forget that foreigners are not supposed to interfere with American elections. And obviously, Chinese for Affirmative Action is one of the founding members of Stop AAPI Hate. So we're aware of it. And I think, addressing China's interference and and intervention in the American political system is a question that is bigger than all of us. It is a question that the US government, as well as other aspects of our society, will have to address. And then I'll leave it to other panelists to address your second question.
Very quick answer. There's no correlation between poverty and violence and crime. In our essays in 1776, if you looked at 10 years of the Depression between 1930 and 1940, when the unemployment rate was 25% for whites, 40% were blacks. Blacks had the highest marriage rate of any group in society. Elderly people could walk safely without fear of being mugged by their grandchildren. And so there's just no correlation at all.
Would anyone else like to add anything?
Yeah, I would. I want to reinforce what Bob is saying there. For too long, I think we have suffered the argument that these are poor people committing these crimes. No, these are thugs that are committing these crimes. And I think that we need to be honest about that and not shy away from it, because we do a great disservice to the law-abiding people in the communities who might happen to be black, but they're not criminals, but there are thugs often who come in from outside the community, and some are within the community, but there is a disrespect for the law, disrespect for the rules of society. That's what causes it to happen, not because they're.
With reference, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
I think with reference to one of the comments or questions made by Kathy, I think we should encourage members of the Chinese and Asian community to speak out about the problems truthfully, about the untoward actions of the Chinese Community Party in terms of our rights and the actions that we are taking. For instance, with reference to the balloons, as well as the cover-up of what I call the Wuhan virus, we really don't have our prominent Asian leaders, particularly the Chinese leaders, pointing out that some of these actions are not truthful on the part of the Chinese Communist Party, and that we as Americans stand for the rights that we have here in America, and that their interference is not welcome. And then with reference to the issue of reparations, I thought hard and long about that. I initially wanted to point out that actually the Chinese community during the 1800s, all the way up to even the 1960s, suffered as much, if not more, than other communities in terms of discrimination in various facts that we should be included with reference to the reparations, that the law, as stated again by the legislators, tends to divide communities instead of looking at the common factors that we have across the communities to unite us. Because certainly we can understand some of the discriminations that were imposed upon the African American community, because it was certainly very similar, if not worse, here in California due to the California exclusion laws than what has happened with reference to housing discrimination, education discrimination, employment discrimination, and others. So it is an opportunity to use that reparation for understanding between different ethnic communities.
Okay, so we're now at 11 o'clock. We'll just take one more question from Terrence, who is now on the screen with us, and I'll let you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your podcast, and then go ahead and please go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, this is Terrence or DK from African American Conservatives. We have a podcast that I'd like to invite most of you on, or all of you on. It's a very fascinating discussion. My question involves COVID, because from what I can tell, just looking at the numbers, so much of the anti-Asian violence really began to spike late 2020, 2021. During or post the pandemic. And I've noticed that so much of the liberal leadership, especially the Black liberal leadership, bent over backwards to absolve China from any blame for the virus. In fact, it was the Black leadership, they were often the loudest to condemn the use of the phrases Kung flu or the China virus. I just heard Betty say the phrase Wuhan virus. I know if I had said that, there would have been a Black liberal to smack me across the mouth for using that phrase. So I'm wondering, is the anti-Asian violence related to COVID? And since the leaders that Blacks listen to most closely, the commentators on MSNBC and so forth, have worked so hard to protect China from any blame for the COVID virus, why is there a disconnect between the Black leadership and the Black people who are committing these acts, if these acts are caused by resentment of the virus?
So who would like to take that question? So why don't I start with sort of the first part of your question, which has to do with Black leaders and their reaction to the terms Kung flu and whatever else that it was Trump used, China virus. In fact, I actually did a podcast on this, and Linda Yang was one of the featured guests. I think that obviously we would, let's just say that the terms used were kind of unpresidential and a little bit unseemly, but Trump has obviously shown that he's not exactly a conventional kind of president. He talks differently to other presidents. And I had, 4 or 5 or 6 grassroots activists on my podcast, and Linda was one of them. And I went around asking every single one of them, do you consider the term Kung flu to be racist? And every one of them came back and said, no, certainly not in the context that Trump used it. I think there's kind of a similar problem of what you describe in the Chinese and Asian American community, which is that there are a lot of very liberal Asian American leaders, whether they're community leaders or elected officials, who claim to represent the community, who are always sort of yammering on about white supremacy, about racism, about America being systemically racist, this and that, but their views often do not reflect many in the different Asian communities that they claim to represent. And so, in terms of the Black leaders who have kind of gotten bent out of shape about these terms, they're certainly not the only ones getting bent out of shape about them. Plenty of others have as well, but I'll let others speak to whether there's also a huge disconnect between Black leaders who claim to represent Blacks across America and, you know, and the ordinary citizens themselves.
With reference to Terrence's comments, I have been very disappointed in our own Chinese American community, not only with reference to the Wuhan virus and the cover up with reference to it, but the terror and the fear that communist China is now practicing, quote, military maneuvers in the Taiwan seas near Taiwan. I think that we need to do more work within our own community to stand up for what is right and what and we are of Chinese descent. I don't want to go to war with China. I am proud of my Chinese heritage. However, truth again needs to prevail. If the native country is not doing the right thing, I think the Chinese community needs to coalesce together to let them know that we across the seas find their actions to be offensive for the peace that we need, the peaceful competition that we need between our two countries.
Would anyone else like to chime in?
Ying,
Yes.
I say that part of the reluctance of many people to identify it as the Wuhan virus or whatever is we just don't know. We don't know whether the virus started in China or wherever. We have a strong suspicion. We have a lot of data that's coming from many sources, but I believe that our reluctance of people, regardless of our identity, is due to the fact that we just don't know. And there were many years of the 3-year period during which we've had to deal with this, that we were stumbling around as a society, trying to figure out what is this, where did it start, how are we supposed to react to it? Do we keep our social distance? Do we wear a mask? I mean, there's just been a profound period of uncertainty. And so I don't think it's any planned out strategy. I just, at the point of being redundant, I would say we just don't know. We haven't known.
Okay, so we're gonna call this session to a close because it's already kind of gone longer than we expected. I'll give all our panelists a sort of a final opportunity to say a quick word before we end. Would anybody else like to offer any final words before we bid farewell to our attendees?
No, just God bless those that have nothing to say and got the good sense not to say it.
I'm usually not amongst them, for better or worse. All right, well, thank you all. Bob Woodson, Linda Yang, Betty Chu, Ward Connerly, Wai Wah Chin. Thank you all for joining us today and for all that you guys do in your respective communities as well as across the country. You know, I think so many of us are grateful for your contributions over the years. So it's an honor being on the same panel with all of you. And I want to thank our attendees, members of the media, as well as members of the public. I want to say a special thanks to the staff of the American Ideals PAC, our team members. We don't have that many of them, and because we're a brand new organization, it's not like we pay everybody a fat paycheck. We just are not able to do that. Some of them have volunteered their time. Some of them have given us stiff discounts. I'm not going to name everybody, and not everybody even shows up on our website, but I want to thank them for their contributions. You know, know, I am a big fan of their professionalism and their expertise. We can't do this kind of work without them. So thank you, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job, Ying.
Thank you.